Hello, everybody. It's great that so many people are joining us this morning. So first of all, myself and Emma, we're going to talk about risk of bias 2. And in the method support unit, we see an awful lot of examples of how people use risk of bias 2 in Cochrane reviews. And we provide advice and guidance on how to apply this methodology and how to make your risk of bias assessments really sound. So what we thought we'd do today is we'd share sort of some of our experience of seeing risk of bias 2. So we're going to look at good practice, and we're also going to look at some common errors that we often see. Okay. So just a brief structure of how we're doing this session. So I'm going to give a little bit of a refresher about RoB2, very brief. I'm kind of assuming that most people on this call will be reasonably familiar with RoB2, if not very familiar. Then I'm going to be kind of good cop, and I'm going to look at some examples of good practice that we see when using RoB2. And then Emma is going to talk about some common errors that we see when people are using RoB2. And I think it's important to emphasize that these are common errors. These are mistakes that we see very frequently. We're not kind of highlighting sort of particular individual mistakes. Then Emma's going to talk a little bit about some resources and further reading on RoB2 for people who are interested. And then we'll open up for discussion and questions. We're hoping to kind of the formal presentation will be quite short. So we're hoping to allow lots of time for discussion. Okay, so a brief timeline of RoB2 in Cochrane. So in 2016, RoB2 was developed to replace the previous risk of bias tool, which we now call RoB1. And then in 2017, the Cochrane Scientific Committee formally approved the RoB2 for use in Cochrane reviews. In 2019, Cochrane launched a pilot to pilot the use of RoB2 in Cochrane. And this was launched in the Cochrane governance meetings in Krakow. And then going forward to 2020, Cochrane published its first review of using RoB2, and that was a review on physical activity interventions for people with congenital heart disease by Williams et al. And then after 2020, we began a scaling up phase, and the editorial board in 2020 released a position statement. And in summary, the position that Cochrane takes is that RoB2 is the preferred tool for Cochrane reviews, and it's the tool that's described in the current version of the Cochrane handbook, but it is, however, not compulsory, and there isn't an expectation that review updates will need to use RoB2, but it is the preferred tool. Okay, this is just one slide because, as I said, I'm assuming that people do know a little bit about RoB2 already. So risk of bias 2 is for use with any type of randomized trial. There are other tools for non-randomized trials that we recommend in Cochrane. It's results-based, which is a really key difference from RoB1. So what you're doing with RoB2 is that you're assessing the risk of bias for a specific numerical result. It's not for a whole study, it's for an individual result. So RoB2 has 5 domains focused on key areas at the potential risk of bias. And of course, this has been informed by research about what areas in randomized trials do create the potential for risk of bias. And those 5 domains are focused on those 5 areas. Within each domain, there's a series of signaling questions, and these act as an algorithm to guide your judgment for each domain. And the signaling questions encourage you to kind of think in quite a bit of depth about whether there might be a risk of bias in that particular domain. For each domain, you get a result, which could be high risk, some concerns, or low risk. And also the domain there is also an overall judgment for each particular domain. So essentially, if any of the domains in any of the domains are at high risk, you get an overall high risk of bias. If any of the domains are at some concerns of risk of bias, but none are high risk, then you'll get an overall risk of bias of some concerns. And finally, low risk. If all the domains are at low risk, that'll be the overall judgment for that particular result. And there are adaptations for cluster randomized controlled trials and crossover randomized controlled trials. So first of all, we've got a poll just to help sort of guide what I'm going to talk about really, I guess, is which risk of bias 2 domain do you find the most straightforward to complete? So yeah, I guess which domain do you find easiest of the five particular domains? And Dario, I think brilliant, is launching the poll for me. Okay, just letting a few more people complete the poll. It's looking like there's a clear winner. Okay. Yeah, if we can end the poll now. Brilliant. Okay. So that's quite interesting, actually, and probably, and I guess actually probably does reflect our kind of experience of talking to people about RoB2. So domain 1, the randomization process, is overwhelmingly the most straightforward. That's really interesting, and the least favorite is bias due to deviations from intended interventions. And again, that does kind of chime with our experience about what people do find harder. Very interesting. Okay, thanks very much. I will just shut that down. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the domains and I'm going to kind of give a good practice example for each one, which hopefully will kind of give some guidance to people about how you should be thinking about that domain. Okay, so yeah, just to note that I'm quoting from guidance in this presentation, and the guidance is all on the Risk of Bias Info website, which is curated by the team from Bristol who've developed and run the tool. There's a really full guidance document, which is great, and also a crib sheet to help you use the tool. Okay, so domain 1, which people generally find most straightforward, which is great. So domain 1 asks about randomization, and essentially aims to explore whether the randomization has been carried out sufficiently well. So there is one signaling question though, 1.3, which people do find difficult, which asks whether baseline imbalances suggest a problem with randomization. Okay, so what I've got here is an example from a review, and this review is the ultrafiltration for acute heart failure review, which is published in 2020. And the example, the picture in the middle, is an example of the judgment, and this is how a risk of bias 2 table appears when a review is published. Okay, so the key thing about signaling question 1.3 is that what we're looking for is to find out whether the balance of baseline characteristics might suggest that something has gone wrong with the randomization process. So we're not asking are baseline characteristics balanced, we're saying are they balanced sort of reasonably? We expect some chance variation because that does happen when you get randomization, that by chance you might get more in one group than another. But overall, does it look as if it's a randomization has worked, if that makes sense? So in this review, you can see that the authors have noted that one of the baseline characteristics is not perfectly balanced between the groups, but they conclude that that could easily have happened to chance because it's quite a small sample size. So those characteristics, that the balance between baseline characteristics is not suggesting a problem with randomization. Okay, so moving on to domain 2, which is the least favorite domain, and we do understand that, and we do hear that a lot from people. So this domain 2 is the old RoB1 question that asked about blinding of patients and of clinical personnel, or personnel kind of implementing the intervention. And I think in the past, the question in RoB1 was quite straightforward, because it was just about, were participants and personnel blinded? And I guess, I personally have done this, and I'm sure that we've all done this, is noted that participants and personnel aren't blinded, and we've ticked high risk of bias. However, with risk of bias 2, with the revised tool, we're asking people to think in a little bit more depth about whether perhaps a lack of blinding might have actually affected an effect estimate, rather than just assuming that it has, if that makes sense. So just to know, for domain 2, you can approach in a couple of different ways. You can assess the risk of bias if you're thinking about whether you're looking at the effect of allocating people to an intervention, or you can assess the risk of bias whether you want to think about whether people have adhered to an intervention. So the example I'm using is about people being allocated to an intervention. That's the most common way that the tool is used. Okay. So what we're asking in domain 2 is, even if we're asking about, has there been a risk of blinding? And we're also, as I said, asking about whether this might have affected the outcome. What we're not asking about is whether people in the intervention arms perhaps did something slightly different from the original intervention, but that might well have been expected within the trial protocol, if that makes sense. So if you allocate somebody to an intervention, sometimes a trial protocol will say, it's okay if people kind of decide to swap interventions. If people decide to take extra drugs or decide to have some extra therapy, because that might happen in real life, and that's not necessarily a cause of bias. So what we're specifically asking about is, because people were in a trial, did that affect the intervention that they ended up getting or seeking out for themselves? So I've got a couple of examples to try and explain that a bit better. So the first example is from a review on perioperative enhanced recovery programs for women with gynae cancers, published in 2022. So what the review authors are saying here is that people were aware of their assigned intervention, so participants and carers were not blinded. But because both interventions were sort of advertised around the department where people were being treated, they think that there's a strong reason to believe that people perhaps in the control group might have sought out the actual intervention under study. And so that might cause a risk of bias, because that wouldn't happen in routine practice. Another example I've got is a few years ago, I ran a trial of computerized cognitive behavior therapy for people with depression. There were 3 arms. There was a couple of different computerized cognitive behavior therapy interventions, and there was a control arm. And one of the computerized interventions was actually free to use. Anybody could log onto the web and access this intervention. And what we discovered when we were looking at the evidence from the trial was that a lot of people in the control group actually did access computerized therapy, even if they weren't allocated to that. And you can perhaps argue that one of the reasons that they did that was because they found out about that intervention through being in a trial. Part of the consent process is you talk through the different arms that you could be randomised into. So for that trial, you could conclude that there was a risk of bias because participants took part in an intervention that they would not otherwise have done had they not been in a trial. Okay, I think I've just got one more example on domain 2, as it does raise questions. So this is slightly different. So in this study, the review authors concluded that even though the intervention was not blinded, they don't believe that that actually led to bias. And what they say is that they've seen no significant signs of crossover or other deviations arising due to the trial context. So they've scored that at low risk of bias, and that's a very reasonable position to take. If you can see no evidence of crossover or other deviations. Okay, on to domain 3. And again, domain 3 didn't score particularly highly on the poll, interestingly. So this is a missing data outcome, and we're asking about whether there's missing data. And again, the signaling questions are quite detailed and help you to think this through in quite a bit of depth. So what we're looking at is, firstly, was outcome data available for all or very nearly all participants? And we also, as we move through the signaling questions, we're asking about if missingness could depend on the true value of the outcome, and is it likely that the missingness in the data depended on the true value of the outcome? Okay, so what you're looking at here is you need to think about whether the missing data is actually different from the true value of the outcome. This takes place when you do a complete case analysis. So you're only looking at the data from the participants that actually were still in the study at a particular time point. And you can look for various clues as to whether the true value of the outcome and the missingness mechanism, the reason that people are missing, could be related. And one of the signals that you look for is if there's an imbalance in attrition between the two groups. So again, for this example, about looking at low carbohydrate versus balanced carbohydrate diets, the authors have looked at this domain and concluded it's at high risk of bias, because as you can see, there's a big differential between the two groups in terms of missingness, and this acts, as a signal that potentially, because of the differential attrition, the missingness could depend on the true value of that outcome. So the participants who dropped out actually had a different outcome from the participants that remained in the study. Okay, and some kind of missingness are okay. For example, data could be missing, for example, if a piece of equipment failed. So, if a blood pressure machine failed to measure data, and that's why the data are missing, you can conclude that missingness is at random. It doesn't depend on what the true value of the data actually were. And also sometimes in a study, trialists will exclude people after randomization if they subsequently discover that somebody wasn't actually eligible for the trial, and that does happen quite a bit. And again, that's missing at random. It's nothing to do with what the true value of those participants' outcome would have been. They should never have been included in the first place. Okay, and finally, nearly finally, domain 4, which looks quite complicated. But yeah, you can sort of, follow the algorithm. It does take you through all the decisions you need to make. This algorithm is also about blinding, but this is about blinding of outcome assessors. So people who are measuring people's outcomes, and outcome assessors, they can be clinicians measuring an outcome. There are also a lot of patient-reported outcomes that we see. And patient-reported outcomes are often quite subjective outcomes, which is an important thing to think about. So my example for this one is from a review on convalescent plasma for people with COVID-19, published in 2023, actually, just a couple of weeks ago. And what the review authors are saying here is that the measurement of the outcome was appropriate, and it is unlikely to differ between intervention groups. But because this is adverse events, they say that the outcome assessors were aware of the interventions received. However, they note that external monitoring was performed to assess protocol adherence. And so therefore they're concluding that it's unlikely that outcome assessment was influenced by knowledge of the intervention. Okay, my final example is about is the final domain, domain 5. And domain 5 is about selection of the reported result. So what we're looking for here is, have trialists perhaps tried to present results that they think may be more favourable, or, you know, depending what their sort of unconscious bias might be, are they presenting results that are sort of selected and don't perhaps reflect the actual results from the trial? Now, this is from a review which is still in press, and this is from a review that I'm an author on, mental health first aid as a tool for improving mental health and well-being. So I realise that I'm picking a good example from a review of my own. So to balance that out, Emma will talk about an example from this review, which is not an example of good practice. I just want to emphasise that as well. But I am going to talk about the good practice from this review first of all. As it's not published, I'm showing you the Excel spreadsheet, which is where you could enter your judgments. It's not published. We haven't got the proper table yet. So what we say here, so the outcome is around whether people can recognise a mental health condition from a vignette. So we argue that there is only one kind of outcome measure for this particular domain. So we're saying that it's not possible that they selected a different outcome measure. And we're also arguing that because the trialists have presented the data in a raw format, they've just presented the crude figures of numbers who can recognise and numbers who can't recognise. So the trialists haven't sort of selected a particular analysis because they've just presented us with some raw data. So this domain is, for this result, is unlikely, is at low risk of bias. So we were reasonably happy with that. Sorry, some concerns. We couldn't find any kind of plan for analysis, which gave us some concerns for this domain. Okay, so that concludes the good cop section, the good practice section. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Emma for the where we see common problems.